There's not a war. I mean, we are at war against drug trafficking organizations. It's not a war against Venezuela.
Hello, listeners. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
And this is the Little Marco Happy at Last edition. And we're going to be talking about Venezuela today. We're going to be talking about the place of the Secretary of State, who's also the National Archivist, Neil. And I think he has 2 or 3 other little jobs. But we are going to start with the news item about which I am incandescent, which is the murder of a woman in Minneapolis by an ICE officer. Now, we know actually that the Trump administration has no regard for human life. They have been murdering people in the Caribbean. They have been murdering people in Venezuela. They send people off to be tortured in places like Sikot. But for some reason, this particular murder feels like a pivot point. Yesterday, 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good, a poet, a mother of 3, and a United States citizen, let me underline, a United States citizen who had no obligation to respond to an ICE officer, was murdered by an ICE officer. Now, I was going to say he has yet to be identified, but in fact, it appears that his name is Jonathan Ross. I am getting that from The Intercept. I hope that's true, and I'm not slandering somebody else named Jonathan Ross. Confronted by ICE vehicles for unknown reasons, and there are a lot of stories out there about what Renee Good was actually doing on the street, whether she was trying to interrupt the ICE agents, whether she was actually waving them around. We have no idea what she was doing there. The officer, let's say it's Jonathan Ross, ordered her to get out of the car. He was screaming at her. He was cursing at her. He was waving a gun. And Good was in the car with her wife and dog, and as she attempted to leave the scene, which any sane person would do if they were being screamed at by a masked man with a gun, he shot her 3 times. Her car continued to move, because when you die, your foot goes down on the accelerator. It slammed into another vehicle. Now, what has been the response of the Trump administration, Neil?
Well, I think the easiest way to put it is just straight up lies about what happened. Kristi Noem is calling her a domestic terrorist, the woman who was murdered, that this was an act of defense on the part of the ICE agent, and, similar statements along those lines. I think, first of all, it's just so disgusting and horrific and terrifying what has happened. Also, we've all seen the video, which is also horrific and terrifying, that we live in a world where this is what we're subject to constantly. And yet I think there's something important about both bearing witness to these atrocities and also being able to point to a clear piece of evidence of what actually happened, and to know that no, she wasn't an aggressor here. She wasn't a domestic terrorist, that this wasn't an act of defense. This was a violent provocation, and a murderous one. And what else is there to be said? And also that this was, from what we've heard, more generally reported about ICE's engagement on the ground in Minneapolis. This was the very provocation that their whole presence is sort of meant to bring about, right? They sent, is it 1,000 ICE agents into Minneapolis to terrorize in these ways? And obviously, and not surprisingly, it's going to end in these types of events.
Yeah, and I think part of what is enraging about this is, first of all, we have all seen the video, and all kinds of experts have taken a look at the video. I mean, I've seen prosecuting attorneys who have looked at 5 different angles of this video, and they're telling a story that is absolutely different from what is coming out of the White House. And on the one hand, people in the White House are telling deliberate lies about what occurred. They are slandering this woman, and then they're saying, well, you should always do what an officer of the law tells you to do. And if you don't, it's really your fault if he turns around and kills you. And that is actually not true either. It is against the law. And let me also say that I've seen a lot of stuff from real police officers that say, first of all, the idea that this guy was about to be run over by a car. Apparently, he was run over and dragged by a car driven by an immigrant that he was trying to arrest about, 3 months ago or something like that. All right, if he's still got PTSD, take him off the street. But second of all, you are not supposed to stand in front of a car. There is no police training manual in the world that says if you're trying to arrest somebody, stand in front of their car. Second of all, there's no police manual in the world that says that you should shoot at a moving vehicle. I realize that this happens on television and in the movies all the time, but it is not supposed to happen in real life because terrible things happen as a consequence. It's very fortunate that Renee Good's car did not hit somebody else as it was veering out of control with her just sort of stomped down on the accelerator. Her wife was in the car. Her dog was in the car. I'm just enraged about this. And I'm particularly enraged that the Trump administration thinks we are all so stupid that they can tell us anything. And, you and I were talking before we got on the broadcast about the fact that I just reread 1984. One of the essential themes of Winston being reprogrammed by the authorities in 1984 is that he has to come to terms with what he sees is not true unless he is told it is true. That it is the regime that defines truth, and that if you believe what is in front of your eyes, as opposed to what you're being told by the regime, you just need to keep working on it until you get to what they want you to believe. And we seem to be at that place. And I don't see any impulse to stop this in the Republican Party. I don't know how much they want us to take before they're willing to admit that there is something terribly, terribly wrong going on here.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. And I think only with that not happening, then the only other option is for things to get a lot worse. That this is not, the breaking point or the, point of clarity and, redirection here, but it's just a precedent that's going to be, set other things in motion and then allow other things to happen. And you said your comment about like how stupid the Trump administration regards us. And I think that's a big part of this. And I would add to that also, which feels really clear to me in this moment, how much they hate us, how much they hate Americans.
Yeah. Yep.
Even if there's some sort of way in which this is politically, legally justified to them on some terms, you still speak about a moment like this with such gravity and such humility and such depth of loss.
Yes.
Even as you maybe defend it, right? There's none of that. I mean, she asked for this is what they're saying, essentially.
Yeah.
And that is a disgusting, disgusting degradation of American life that I think is writ large for them and how they think about most of us.
Yes.
And that is horrific to come from an administration.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Neil. And one of the things that I didn't expect, but I missed, that would have come out of, say, a Reagan administration or a George W. Bush administration would have been somebody getting up and saying, we are looking into this. This is, of course, a terrible tragedy. We will be investigating to see how it happened. The officer has been put on leave. None of that. None of that. It's just like everybody is wrong but us. And you're right. They do hate us. They actually do hate us, which is difficult to know how to respond to because as Christians, you and me, we know that responding to hatred with hate isn't going to get us anywhere. But most of us don't want to give our lives for it either.
Right. And nor be consumed by that because nothing comes from that. Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could have an entire episode about this because it is so horrific and it's so important.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would say is, because I think there's a Trump administration response to this, there's also a conservative media response to this and sort of a larger conservative American response to all this. And those things are overlapping and reinforcing, right? But like there's going to be a moment at some point when this man is identified. And then what will happen? There'll be a GoFundMe page created for him. There'll probably be millions of dollars raised for him. I mean, it's very easy to imagine him as one of the speakers at the next RNC, will run for governor. I mean, like I'm saying that somewhat in jest and not at all. Like those things are very real possibilities because we've seen them happen over and over again in other similar situations in the last couple of years. And so I think it speaks to just the larger culture of, I don't even want to call it conservatism, of MAGA, right? The larger culture of MAGA and all the ways it's distorting everything.
Well, and one of the things that I've been thinking about is, since we just passed the 5th anniversary of January 6th, was Ashley Babbitt. And how, Ashley Babbitt wouldn't have been murdered if she hadn't entered the Capitol illegally with an armed mob and been breaking a window with a hammer as a Capitol police officer told her to stand back, stand back, stand back. She would not have been shot had that not happened. It was, in fact, a tragedy that she lost her life. But she became a saint and a martyr to the MAGA movement. She became one of those white women who stands in for purity and goodness and everything that needs to be protected in the United States. And honestly, I would just like to say to MAGA now, if Ashley Babbitt had stayed home, she wouldn't be dead either. And so there is difficulty they have as they move from story to story. They don't feel like they have to clean up anything. All right. So we're sticking with Minnesota for a little bit with the news summary. The next topic is Governor Tim Walz, who has dropped his bid for a third term in the wake of an alleged multi-billion-dollar scheme to divert federal dollars intended for Minnesota-subsidized child care. The state's popular senior Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar is said to be almost certain to run in 2026. If she wins, she or Walz will pick someone to fill her seat. That person could run in the special election to replace her. Now, the question is, who's that going to be? So I took a look at the congressional delegation, and there are a number of people there who might be interesting. But also there's the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, who has been right out there with this recent murder in his city. And then there's Keith Ellison, who was the former representative from Minnesota 05 and is currently an attorney general. Now, he has been also a little bit caught up in this scandal, but only to the extent that people are asking, why wasn't the Attorney General's office on top of it? Neil, what are the implications of Walz stepping down, and what are the implications of Klobuchar making a move to the governor's office?
Well, I think we can say it will not be Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, right.
Put in this place. I think, honestly, I found this a little surprising to hear that Klobuchar was like eyeing the governorship, because I don't know, I felt like you could imagine a person like Klobuchar having several more terms in the Senate safely and just sort of building out a long career there. But I also think there's a good, she ran for the presidency. I think she has real interest in sort of executive roles. Mm-hmm. And so I imagine that's part of it. I would have thought that Ralph Ellison would have probably been the most likely one here.
You mean Keith Ellison.
Keith Ellison. Sorry about that. Wishful thinking there. Keith Ellison would have been the name. But I do think obviously Jacob Frey is having a big moment right now in terms of the visibility around what's happening in Minneapolis, and what a terrible reason to have that visibility. But I'm seeing so many people repost this press conference moment he gave yesterday, or maybe this morning, telling ICE to get the F out of Minneapolis. So I could see, as often happens in these horrific moments, sort of skyrocketing to a big.
Yeah, I'm gonna put my money on Jacob Fry. I think Klobuchar, who was a couple years behind me at Yale, and so I like her from way back then. But she's from the Iron Range, which is the northernmost part of Minnesota near Canada. She has always been a really good statewide candidate. She even gets the vote in the Iron Range, which is very, very conservative. My sense of Klobuchar is that it's very frustrating to be in the Senate if you really want to do things. You know, after she ran for president, she wrote a great book about regulating the internet, and it fell flat. Nobody paid any attention to it. We haven't regulated the internet. We wring our hands about it a lot. But she had some very good ideas for how to use antitrust law to bring the tech billionaires to heel. And that kind of work is really mostly being done at the level of the state nowadays. So I think she can win. And my guess is that she actually wants to do some work. I mean, the Senate just doesn't do anything nowadays. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably a huge part of it. Like, such a smart, ambitious woman who I think has really shown throughout her career and was very much part of her biography when she was running for president. Like, I get things done. And there's a sort of like scrappy Midwesternness to that. Like the way she characterizes that sort of work ethic, right? And also I think there's like a little bit of a throwback feminism to it. Like, I'm the woman who's like gonna get stuff done when you men are like, you know, dicking about. And I think also, and I think also she really, really cares about, I mean, I think like there's been lots of profiles of her and many of them are not all that flattering of what she's like as a boss and to work with and all those things. And, you know, there's been lots of gendered analysis of those profiles and all the rest. But I think the takeaway I always had from that was just like, God, this woman is the hardest working woman. And like, she's like frustrated with incompetence all around her. So you can see, especially in the Senate right now, that it's like just a worthless body. The desire to go back to a state that really matters and that's really important in so many ways for the nation and the economy and all that, and like just getting things done.
Right. No, I agree. And, you know, it's funny how it's always the women who get blamed for being cruel to their staffers. Isn't that interesting? And I never really know whether it's the staffers who actually want something else from women and sort of kind of take advantage of them, or whether it's just like, you know, a reflexive sexism. I mean, I remember after I did that piece on the women who were running for president back in 2015, I was on MSNBC, and the woman I was on with when the Amy Klobuchar thing came up said, "I don't want to hear about it. Those men on the Hill work their staffers like mules." And I was like, okay, girl. All right, let's jump to the next news item. And this one should have the headline, "Queer People Strike Back." Donald Trump added his own name to the Kennedy Center, not only outraging the ginormous Kennedy family, but causing numerous artists scheduled to perform there to cancel. And they canceled on Christmas Eve, and they canceled on New Year's Eve, and they have canceled until the end of time. Neil, I'm so happy about this. How about you?
Of course, yeah, good for them. I mean, would you want to go perform there? Like, and it's such an easy and impactful thing to do. Right. Screw that appearance.
That's right.
This is so stupid and yet so evocative of like so much that's happening, from the just insatiable narcissism of this man and the complete kowtowing of every spineless person around him, and that like this is what so much of the efforts of this administration are directed towards, while everything else is falling apart. I mean, they're also doing a lot of, like, as we'll talk about, horrific actions that are proactively engaged, but like naming the Kennedy Center the Trump Kennedy Center, like, and like the next step is to take the Kennedy name off of this, right? Like, this is like, you know, stage 4. But
how will they hook John F. Kennedy up to Jeffrey Epstein?
That's a good question.
How will that happen?
Well, I think that's where AI comes in, right? Like, we need a bot to generate, you know, a picture of them with their arms around each other.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and I saw Doug Verone of the Doug Verone Dance Company, which has been around for 40 years or so. And, Rick Grinnell came on and said that they were going to sue everybody and they were going to sue people for millions of dollars for canceling and so on and so forth. And Doug Verone just said, that is nonsense because every contract we sign has a clause in it that either party gets to pull out if something happens that would damage their reputation. So if the Doug Verone Dance Company says they are going to show up completely nude and do a dance in the Raw, the Trump Kennedy Center gets to cancel it. And vice versa. And if they say, this is not good for our reputation to perform there, that's in the contract, right? So there we go. All right. So we've taken a wrecking ball to culture in the Capitol. But now we have some good news, Neil. In a 4-1 ruling, Wyoming's Supreme Court has struck down 2 laws banning abortion in the state as unconstitutional, including the first law in the nation to ban chemical abortions, right? So this law passed in the legislature was supposed to ban chemical abortions completely. It would make Wyoming the only state to do that. The court, which has been appointed all by Republicans, because I don't think a Democrat has been elected in Wyoming for decades, cited a 2012 amendment approved by voters in the wake of the ACA, empowering adults to make their own health decisions. So, actions have consequences, Neil. How did you parse this?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to parse this. One is about just sort of a political analysis of Wyoming, and I saw so many articles referring to Wyoming as quote, a very conservative state, which it's true, although I would say it is of a conservatism historically that leans much more libertarian than sort of social conservatism. Right. And that seems really important here, especially for the issue that we're talking about. Because I think, if you look at something like rankings of states by religiosity, Wyoming falls into the middle of the pack, which is to say that it's sort of kind of religious and kind of not. But among conservative states, that puts them sort of on the lower end. So there's not the sort of religious social conservatism in Wyoming that there are in so many other deep red states that I think would handle these issues much differently. And so I see a sort of Western mountain libertarianism at work here in this particular, in the sort of chain of events that led to this, both in terms of the constitutional amendment and the Supreme Court's decision here.
Yeah, and I would have to dig into this a little bit more, but I think the fact that this amendment was passed in 2012 is very significant because you remember all that opposition to the ACA, a lot of it was framed about the fictional death panels that would be set up in Washington that would decide that people were not going to get medical care after all, we were just going to let them die. Or that people could sort of illegally persuade their elderly relatives that they didn't actually want to give them medical care anymore and it was time for them to die, and so on. But the idea that actually the ACA was making life and death decisions for Americans, then I think, and I have to look into it a little bit more, but I think this is what prompted a referendum to amend the Constitution to say that all adults got to make their own health decisions, that they couldn't be made by anybody else. Now, what's significant about this is that this is also the first state Supreme Court decision to define abortion as health care. Right? And so the anti-abortion forces have spent decades trying to say that abortion is not health care, that it's, some kind of rogue birth control, that it's a crime, that it's murder, that it's this, that it's that. But this Supreme Court decision says, yes, abortion is health care and adults get to make that decision on their own and you don't get to ban it. Legislature. So that is the one piece of good news that we have this week, Neil. I'm sorry. Now we're going to go back into the bad news. Venezuela. On the evening of Saturday, January 3rd, a special forces team from the United States, supported from the air, penetrated the compound in Caracas, Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores were living. after killing their bodyguard, a group that apparently included a lot of specially trained Cubans. We should talk about that. The team kidnapped them and took them to New York, where they were charged this week for narco-terrorism. Neil, what are the issues we need to be thinking about in this case?
Well, I mean, where do we start?
Where do we start?
I mean, I think let's put the narco-terrorism aside for a moment and just talk about like the event itself and what that represents. U.S. president invading another country without authorization by Congress or even briefing of the relevant committee of what they were doing, and kidnapping a president, extraditing them to the U.S. to stand trial. And I mean, among the charges are that Maduro has violated U.S. firearm laws? Like, what in the world? Like, how does any of this stand up in a court of law, let alone adhere to the Constitution?
Yeah, it's very bizarre. And let's sort of mark out the things that we know are illegal. We know, for example, that there is a convention that the United States has signed off on that says you actually cannot try foreign heads of state in your country. Now, the United States has done this several times. The United States has also previously kidnapped a foreign head of state, and I'm thinking of the president of Panama. What was his name?
What was his name?
Do we remember this? I don't know.
It'll come to me in a second.
Right. All right. Anyway, we kidnapped the president of Panama, and also the president of Honduras was tried in this country for narco-terrorism. And we know this because Donald Trump just pardoned him and sent him back to Honduras right before he kidnapped Nicolas Maduro. So there's that. The second thing is that the United States is making claims, and this is all very muddled because different people in the Trump administration are saying different things. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, who says different things every day.
Right, of course.
But Stephen Miller and Marco Rubio, for example, are saying very different things about why the United States did this. Stephen Miller said, the Western Hemisphere and everything in it belongs to the United States. And the sooner all of these countries recognize that, the better. Marco Rubio is kind of like, oh, no. We'll talk a little bit more about Marco later and what role he's playing in this. And he's saying, no, we're just going to run the country for a little while and do it until it stabilizes. Now, they have left in place the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, and she has in fact been sworn in. But the question is Delcy Rodriguez on the same page as them? Yesterday, the New York Times obtained a 90-day emergency order issued by the government by Delcy Rodriguez, but apparently it was signed by Nicolas Maduro, who couldn't have possibly signed it because he wasn't actually there. Anyway, apparently this is circulating and orders police to take into custody anyone who supports the armed attack of the United States. Trump is continuing to say, if they don't do what we want, we actually will invade them. Now, country of 33 million people, the size of California, more heavily armed than Texas. Okay, fine. But then there's this whole thing about taking the oil and selling it and keeping it in private banks in the United States and then using it to rebuild. What the hell is going on, Neil? How do we give our listeners a framework for thinking about this clusterfuck?
Well, I think one framework is that Trump is a psychopathic ruler and that this is his latest harebrained scheme. And clearly Republicans were not briefed on this, nor does this represent a coherent foreign policy objective of the administration that got everyone on board with it with a clear communications message about what the strategy was here, as much as this was some middle of the night decision. And I think you see that in the fact that Republicans can't even align on message here, and it's all over the place. None of this is good. I mean, where to take this? One of the things I found really interesting, because when the first response from so many folks was this is all about the oil and stealing the oil, and I think that's not a surprising thought given what's at play here. But that a lot of the oil company executives are saying Venezuela is a thing that we don't want to touch. The infrastructure there is unworkable. It would require billions and billions of dollars in investment just to get it into shape that we could actually use it. That doesn't mean that it isn't in Trump's mind that this is a gold mine that he can offer up to the oil companies for some sort of tit for tat exchange. But clearly, there isn't a plan here. And this is a like minute by minute changing scenario because we have, the person that we do as the president. But, the latest statements today were that we could be running Venezuela for years and years to come. This is from the guy who 5 minutes ago was lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize and saying that like his presidency was going to end all wars around the world. Like, make it stop.
Right. Right. Well, and one of the things that came out of the White House is that Machado, who did, in fact, win the Nobel Peace Prize, that the reason Trump didn't want her to be president is that he thought she should have given him the Nobel Peace Prize. That when she went to accept it, she should have declined it and said, I want to give this to President Donald Trump. And she didn't do that. Now, what he said publicly was that nobody in Venezuela respects her, which is, of course, not true because they voted for her. I mean, somebody else had to be on the ballot as a proxy because she couldn't be on the ballot because they had outlawed her from doing that. But that was all crazy. I want to come back to the oil question here because that is something that is stumping me. It makes me think that a lot of what passes for economics in the White House is not, in fact, a conversation at all. Okay, so oil is running at about $50.30 a barrel, which may seem like a lot of money, but it's actually not a lot of money. And because I watch Landman, this is what I know, that if oil falls under $70 a barrel, it is not profitable. That you can't actually maintain the infrastructure in the United States to pump oil if oil is that low. And so that caused me to actually go on an internet search. And what I learned was that oil fields in the United States are laying people off by the thousands. And all kinds of little, those little towns that are built up around oil fields, they're all sort of being broken up and going away. So I think if Trump was doing it for the oil, we can confidently say that the energy sector is yet another thing that he doesn't understand and that his Secretary of Energy, Doug Burgum, has not explained to him in any coherent way. It's notable that Doug Burgum was completely absent from this conversation about oil. It's also notable that during this lightning raid on Venezuela and everything that followed, J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard were almost completely invisible. How do we read that?
I think the disappearance of Vance is fascinating, given the visibility of him just a few short weeks ago around everything about Charlie Kirk and the, sort of where's Turning Point USA going on and all that. And the seeming coronation of him as the next Republican presidential nominee because, via Erica Kirk. I mean, that was just a few short weeks ago. And yet he's so visibly absent in this huge moment at a time when also Marco Rubio is so present, which we'll say more about. But it certainly, I think, complicates ideas about where, the Republican nomination is most likely to go in 2028. And then Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, you say something about that. I wonder what you think about her lack of visibility here. Is it that she has this long history of criticism about this very sort of U.S. engagement and where is she to be found in this? Say more.
I think that's a big part of it. I think one of the things it pointed me to is actually we have seen almost nothing of Tulsi Gabbard at all. She has not been available during a number of foreign policy, national intelligence moments. She's not in any of the pictures, very often when Bibi Netanyahu shows up, they line everybody up to, sort of create a stage set around Bibi and Trump. Tulsi's not there. So she has been notably absent, period, from this administration for the last year. It is said that had they talked to her, she would have opposed it. I do find it curious that they could do any of this without going through here because, in fact, it is one of those operations that required a massive amount of intelligence. My question is whether they went through the American intelligence apparatus at all or whether they went through, say, Israel? Who knows? So that has yet to be found. I also think Tulsi Gabbard isn't very smart. I've never thought she was very smart. And so having her at the top of the national intelligence apparatus may be filling that position with less with someone who is an advisor and more as someone who can just sort of fill a slot so we don't have to talk about it anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I will co-sign that I do not think Tulsi Gabbard is an intelligent person. I think she has a very particular sort of radical base of supporters behind her that like was politically useful for the Trump administration to make sure, they were appeased and happy
Right.
by her promotion to such a position. I also don't think that even if she were smart, that intelligence is what is driving their ideas about, intelligence, right? Like that. I don't think that this is an evidence-based administration. There's so much here that is really worrisome just from an operations standpoint, including like that this was being run out of Mar-a-Lago, right? And like they just sort of put up a tent, basically.
Yeah.
But her emails, right?
Right. Yeah. And reports today say actually it was a lot trickier than they made out, that one of the helicopters that was bringing the special forces in was hit by incoming fire, that they had to fight their way into the compound. 31 Cubans dead.
Yeah.
That's actually a lot of highly trained soldiers to go through to get to your target. I'd also like to say that today we do have news that the Senate is showing signs of life. They passed a bill invoking the War Powers Act with 5 Republicans voting aye: Rand Paul, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Todd Young, and Josh Hawley, and John Fetterman. And it wasn't clear that John Fetterman was going to vote with the Democrats on this. This will now go to the House, and that should be really interesting to watch next week to see what the House does, because there are a lot of House Republicans who are really, really unhappy about this. Now, before we take the turn into Marco Rubio, I do want to make sure our listeners understand the Monroe Doctrine. I know that sounds boring, but the Monroe Doctrine keeps being invoked by the White House, and now Donald Trump is calling his foreign policy the Donroe Doctrine. Neil, do you want to do the Monroe Doctrine, or shall I?
I can get us started. I think it's like, first of all, is Trump invoking this because like this is the one thing he remembers from like his history class? Like very likely so. That might be true for a lot of us listening, right? Monroe Doctrine, 1823, President Monroe. He was delivering a message to Congress when he announced this, but essentially it was this warning to Europe and to European powers against any, infringement and interference in the Western Hemisphere. Like the Western Hemisphere was the U.S. The region was no longer open to, European ambitions, European engagement, and it was a sphere of interest for the U.S. And that, was a doctrine that shaped especially the following 100 years of history in the region. And I think, continue to have real ramifications through the 20th century. But yeah, I just have this sense that like this is one of 3 things Donald Trump remembers from his U.S. history course way, all those years ago, and loves that it like he can make it rhyme with his own name.
Yeah. Well, and, part of what is interesting about the Monroe Doctrine to me is that the sort of revised history of colonialism in the Western Hemisphere says that everything the United States was illegal. Everything we did was illegal and so on. It was wrong, much of it, but it wasn't necessarily illegal. And I think what most people don't understand is that in the 19th century, foreign policy relied on people just sort of making a statement. And the Monroe Doctrine, you're right, it was Monroe sort of standing up in Congress and saying, this is how things shall be. Mm-hmm. That was the law. And similarly, Theodore Roosevelt, when he became interventionist, announced the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said, foreign powers were not to make investments in the Western Hemisphere that could destabilize the region. And that was the excuse by which Roosevelt occupied Haiti over and over and over again, and Cuba, and so on and so forth. So, law in foreign policy prior to World War II was really much more established on countries saying this is how it shall be and you will obey. That seems to be what the Donroe Doctrine is going back to, is Donald Trump saying the Western Hemisphere is mine and I'll do what I want. So what are the ramifications of this, Neil?
Yeah, and this ties back to what you said a few minutes ago about Stephen Miller's defense of this, right? Like this is aligned with his, like this is ours and this hemisphere is ours. So I think probably what's very likely here is Stephen Miller has like brought this notion to Trump and that's what's shaping it. But sorry, you were asking a question about.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think Stephen Miller has brought this to Trump. And, Trump probably doesn't even remember 3 days later what he thought the Donroe Doctrine was. But I think there are ramifications for other places. And this, of course, immediately came up when Trump said, well, the president of Colombia better watch himself too, or I'll just do the same thing there. And by the way, Greenland is back in the conversation. But this is, of course, I think why the Senate has become active, because an attack on Greenland is in fact an attack on our NATO allies, is it not?
Absolutely. And to really get Europe engaged in opposition to us in a way that I don't think, a good chunk of Republican senators want to see happen.
Right.
The Greenland thing, like I think there's something like that feels almost entirely psychological about that for Trump in a way that like I know, all of this is driven by like psychopathologies in so many ways, but like this is just something like lodged in his head that like he like kind of can't get away from. I do think like the recurrence here, I mean, who knows what's happening on these internal conversations with the administration, but is Stephen Miller giving him sort of this runway where it's like, and these things are next, right? And then like Greenland gets on the list and then, but like just to see this back in play when the conversation is also about like Colombia, Mexico, Iran, and Cuba is a little bit confusing if we're trying to put this in some sort of like rational foreign policy framework, but I don't think that's the right way to think about this.
No, I don't think it's the right way to think about it either. And of course, J.D. Vance has now jumped in and said, oh no, we're not going to invade Greenland. Actually, what makes the most sense would be to buy Greenland. And a reporter said, what do you mean we're going to buy Greenland? And he said, well, like the Louisiana Purchase or, Seward's Folly. I don't think he mentioned Seward's Folly, but I immediately thought of Seward's Folly, which was, of course, listeners, Alaska. And so the question is, I think, what you are raising here, Neil, which is what is the plan? The Trump administration keeps talking about national security, but it is unclear that any of this makes us more secure. However, somebody does have a plan. There is a man with a plan, and that is Marco Rubio, Liddle Marco Rubio. So let's talk about him. Who is Marco Rubio? You are our Florida whisperer, Neil. Tell us who Marco Rubio is.
Well, son of Florida, son of Miami, son of Cuban exiles, 54 years old, someone who really rose very quickly in Florida politics. So just a quick bio here, like Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives, I think at like the age of 35. He was elected to the Senate in 2010, which is now, 15 plus years ago, kind of. It's remarkable like how long ago that was and also how early it was in his life. He replaced Mel Martinez, who was the first Cuban American in the Senate and was a very well-known and well-regarded centrist Republican and also a foreign policy expert. And fun fact, Claire, Mel Martinez lives 1 block from where I am sitting right now. I walk my dog by his house 3 times a day. He lives a block from where I'm staying here in Winter Park, Florida, my hometown, and where all my family is and where I spent a couple months. Yeah, he's literally around the corner. So I see him.
Have you thought of knocking on his door and saying, we'd like you to be on our podcast?
I can see if I run into him on this evening's dog walk. But anyway, so just a little personal aside there. But, I think Rubio was very much, for much of his career, sort of in that vein of sort of Cuban American, right of center, foreign policy expert, Republican senator from Florida, but who in the age of Trump has had to recalibrate in many ways. Some of those, I think, are in real coordination with this Trumpist moment and Trumpism, and I think in some interesting ways show points of divergence that I think are consistent with some core beliefs he still holds, maybe also consistent with or related to his own, future presidential ambitions. But, that's sort of the overview I would give of him and his political career.
That's fabulous. And of course, he ran against Trump in 2015, sort of imagining himself as a Republican version of Jack Kennedy, I think. A sort of man on the move, young man in a hurry kind of thing. And then was utterly humiliated, as everybody in that cohort was, by Donald Trump running away with it. And of course, Donald Trump came up with the nickname Liddle Marco, and he would actually spell it for people. He would say Liddle. It's spelled Liddle, Marco. I mean, horrifying. And the idea that Rubio has actually gone to work with him, with this man who was so horrible to him, is also horrifying. But it also speaks to Rubio's ambition, not just to be president, but to liberate the island of Cuba. And this has been a long-standing obsession of Rubio's, as it is of many in the exile community. Another fun fact, Rubio said for years that his parents had fled Castro. In fact, they fled Batista. They left during the Batista regime. I don't think they were actually fleeing at all. I think they came to the United States for economic reasons because his father went to work, I think, in a casino in Nevada or something like that. Rubio grew up kind of poor. So it's not like he was a member of the Bacardi family that had to move their whole operation to Puerto Rico, but still wants to go back to Cuba. So this has been Rubio's dream for some time, and Venezuela is one step toward that. You want to talk to our listeners about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is sort of the open door by which, well, first of all, Trump's suggesting, Venezuela is the stepping stone to a broader liberation in the region, with Cuba as the place, the sort of the ideal place to culminate this. I think, first of all, as you said, Rubio has always been a hardliner around Cuba, and that's in keeping with a huge, political movement in South Florida that I think has real influence on the Republican Party in general, but particularly in the Trump administration. And so I think, first of all, they're directly threatening Cuba's sovereignty and statements that they've made recently, both Trump and Rubio. What else would you add to that?
Well, one of the things I would add to that is in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally cracked apart, the Soviet Union had been keeping Cuba going economically in a variety of ways, educating people, buying sugar that they didn't need, which was really Cuba's main product for a very long time. And after 1991, the Cuban economy sort of dropped off the cliff. And the person who was there to save them was Hugo Chavez.
Yeah.
And Chavez had just nationalized the oil fields in Venezuela. Chavez did not have, and he had lots of money. And there was a long period, and it's important for listeners to remember this, there was a long period in which a lot of that oil money was being redistributed to the Venezuelan people. So there was a period of about 15 years or so where poor Venezuelans became more educated, they became better housed, and they had better health because Cuba sent them doctors. And what Cuba got in return for those doctors was oil. Now, I had thought that this oil was just going to power Cuba's energy, but in fact, that is not the case. Venezuela would ship them the oil and then say, whatever you do with it, do with it. And Cuba was selling it on the global market. So Cuba's economy for the last 15 years or so, 20 years, has rested on selling Venezuelan oil on the global market. And that oil is now gone. That has been cut off. It is being blockaded into Venezuela. It's certainly not going to get to Cuba. They were chasing down a bunch of oil tankers the other day that were making a break for Russia, but But Cuba is not going to have that anymore. And so when Trump was saying it's a really fragile regime, it's true. It will become more economically fragile. It has become fragile also because of U.S. sanctions. But here's the thing. First of all, I don't think Venezuela is done at this point. And I'm having sort of funny flashbacks to Iraq, which was over. The Second Gulf War was over in about 3 weeks. And then the Iraqi people decided to fight. And Venezuela is really heavily armed. They've got all of these citizen militias that were created by the Maduro regime. They have all of these drug gangs. So it's not altogether clear to me that the story of Venezuela simply bending the knee to Trump is done. It's also not clear to me that if the United States decided to take control of Cuba in a similar way, that would not be a terrible, terrible error. The Cuban people have been preparing for a U.S. invasion for 70 years. And so I think this is a very delicate moment in which the United States could, in fact, end up in a really, really ugly war.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is right, and there's lots of good evidence for that assessment of it. I do think there's also it's been striking to see the videos of like Venezuelans dancing in the streets. So and all these things can be true, right? Like it's a country of 33 million people. There's lots and lots of different factions. Without question, Maduro was a terrible leader in all sorts of different ways, including, horrible rationing of food and real hunger and, just decimation of basic services, of huge political repression and state-sponsored violence and all the rest. So, lots and lots of Venezuelans, both in the country and those living in the U.S., were celebrating this moment. And also there's a powerful regime that right. He's not the sole actor in that I think is really determined to preserve itself.
Right.
So yeah, I think this is really complicated. It was interesting to me to sort of take this conversation a little bit in the different direction and think about it like American public mind of the last week. I think so many Americans are not foreign policy experts, and I would put myself in that camp, and watching sort of online real-time reactions to this and the confusion of how to understand this, because it's Trump invading country, taking a foreign leader hostage, bad, but also isn't that foreign leader really, really bad, and aren't Venezuelans really happy? And so does that mean we should listen to Venezuelans and Miami and New York say that they're happy he's been deported? And so I don't know. It's I think one thing we haven't talked about as much here is sort of Americans grappling with these events and what that means. But I think sort of thinking about the story or the example or the role of Venezuelans, average Venezuelans, both within the country and within the American political landscape, and how those might shape coverage of what's happened and even political decisions around it, is another aspect of this story too that we'll have to watch in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah. So I'm thinking two things. One is Iraqis were in the streets celebrating the end of Saddam Hussein as well. I remember them pulling down the statue, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things that should have been learned from that event was that the United States was wholly unprepared to deliver services to the Iraqi people. So having invaded the country, having decapitated a functioning government, terrible government, but a functioning one, they then were unable to deliver power. They'd knocked out the entire power grid, which also meant that nobody had water. It meant that nobody could refrigerate their food. This is Iraq, people. So if that happens in Venezuela, and Venezuela has not had its services disrupted by the United States, they were ever so briefly. Apparently there was some kind of cyber attack to take out all the electricity and air defenses. But if the United States cannot deliver to the Venezuelan people something better than they had under Maduro, that will be destabilizing, de facto destabilizing. Second of all, possibly one of the things that people did learn from Iraq is that you cannot do what was then called de-Baathification. In other words, everybody that was in the Ba'ath Party had to go. And what was ridiculous about that is that you had to be in the Ba'ath Party to have a government position at all. It didn't mean you were a fan of Saddam Hussein's. So that, I suspect, is true in Venezuela as well. Mm-hmm. So they've left the regime in place, but there's a danger in that because the knives have been out for Maduro for some time. There are people who want to take over from him. Whether they see it in their interest to do business with the United States or not remains to be seen. Okay, so we don't know. The second thing, Neil, and I think pointing us back to the United States is really smart, is that what Trump has done is kind of rejigger what he means by America First. Because a lot of MAGAs came out and said, wait a second, no foreign wars. I thought we said no foreign wars. And he was like, oh, no. We didn't mean no foreign wars. What we meant was no foreign wars that were not in the national interest. And he decides what's in the national interest, right? But I'm not sure that can cover up for the fact that nobody wanted this war, right? There was actually huge popular support for the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan because of 9/11.
Of course, yeah.
Nobody in the United States, except maybe some enclaves in Miami, were saying, let's go to war with Venezuela. So
and I think no American families want to send their sons and daughters there, right, for military engagement. Yeah.
Right. And it's not clear that we can. I mean, look at how Trump has used the American military, right? He's sending them all over the place. He's got most of our Navy down in the Caribbean and in the Pacific trying to keep the oil from leaving. And, he sent the National Guard all over to American cities. So the military is stretched kind of thin right now, doing things that actually aren't that important. Okay, back to Rubio for a second. Word out of Washington is that it was Rubio who persuaded Trump to do this, that this aggressive foreign policy is a make or break moment for Marco Rubio. If it goes south, Rubio's cooked. And he is making an enormous bet that this can boost him into the presidency. But do Americans actually vote on foreign policy?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's not what history shows us. I mean, there have been presidents who care very much about foreign policy and who sort of foreground that in their campaign and in their sort of, justification for why they should be president. But I think we have a lot of political science research that shows that's never the issue that really moves Americans when they vote. I do think there's a way that Rubio can just gain a lot of visibility and sort of good coverage in this moment that would, afford him a real bump in, the possibility that he gets the nomination. I mean, I don't know if you saw this little clip on CBS News the other night, which we should probably do an entire segment about what is happening at CBS News.
My God.
Did you see this segment that closed out the CBS News the other night, which was basically just straight up propaganda that ended with the new anchor saying, "We salute you, Rubio." This is state television happening. So
Right.
There can be a lot more of that really increases his fortune in terms of getting the nomination. Are American voters going to be like, I really liked Rubio's ideas about how to manage the crisis with Venezuela? No, I don't think that's what gets people to pull a lever in a ballot box.
Right. And the only thing he gets out of this, as you're saying, is visibility. He's getting his face out there. I mean, really, the vast number of American voters probably have no idea who Marco Rubio really is.
Yep, of course.
What we have just told them is everything they know about Marco Rubio. What is kind of interesting is that he's actually very much an old media kind of guy. I can't see Marco Rubio on TikTok and Instagram. I mean, JD Vance can sort of barely be on TikTok and Instagram, but I really can't see Marco Rubio thriving there. So I think this is a big gamble on his part. I'm sure there is some piece of it that is just very close to his heart. If he could deliver Cuba back to the people who were chased out by Castro, he would feel he had a life well lived, and maybe being president wasn't important. But this remains to be seen. And we're going to be coming back to him, I'm sure, in the next few weeks. So, Neil, let's talk about what we want to go viral. We've had like a month to come up with cool viral things. What's yours?
Gosh, don't put it that way, because what I'm about to say is not cool at all. But just,
Betty
I don't
Boop.
know.
You're going to talk about Betty Boop being in the public domain, right?
No, I didn't even know about that.
Yeah,
this
Betty
is
Boop
like
is now in the public domain.
Good to know. Well, this is more right up in my wheelhouse. It's another article from Ruth Graham, the incredible religion reporter at the New York Times. This came out yesterday. The headline is Philip Yancey, prominent Christian author, admits to extramarital affair.
I saw that.
Did you see this? Did you know who Philip Yancey was before you saw this article?
Well, when I read the article, I then remembered those books that he wrote back in the 20th century that were incredibly popular and went well beyond a Christian audience. So why don't you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, so that's actually more what I want to talk about, because, like, okay, apparently he had an 8-year affair with a married woman, and so he announced that he would be no longer speaking he was going to retire from writing and public speaking. He's also 76 years old, and he also has, I'm forgetting now, he has some, like, life-ending disease. So whatever. And, like, there's a way that we could talk about this along the, like, lines of, like, hypocrisy and, evangelicals and sex and all those things, whatever. Lots of ink has been spilled in that direction for many a person before. That's not what I find interesting. What I found more interesting is, like, Yancey is someone I knew a lot about, and certainly was very familiar with his sort of public profile as an evangelical writer and speaker, and particularly around the books that he wrote in the 1990s, for which we should say more than 20 million copies of his books have been sold. I mean, we should all be so lucky. There's 2 books that are, like, really his best, most well-known books that, like, really made him famous and have really sold well. Both of them came out in the 90s. One was The Jesus I Never Knew, and I think the biggest book was one
That's the one I read.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, that was hugely popular. Like you said, it had a audience well beyond evangelical circles. And then the other book, which was even bigger, is called What's So Amazing About Grace. Mm. And what I think is so interesting about Yancey, and I think Ruth Graham does a really nice job of tracing here in this piece, is the particular contribution Yancey made through his writings and his public speaking, but particularly through his books, about the notion and the theology of grace, and the way in which in the 90s it was suited for the sort of touchy-feely, soft evangelicalism that was coming into shape in that decades, that was very much connected to non-denominational Protestantism, megachurch evangelicalism, the sort of praise music of the era that a lot of folks called Jesus is my boyfriend music, like the softening of American evangelicalism, the feminization of American evangelicalism that a lot of people have called it, both sort of derisively and supportingly, that really characterized this era. And so Yancey was both, like, someone who shaped that history and also was, like, in step with the broader transformations that were happening in American evangelicalism in that decade. Really nice treatment of that and sort of his contribution there in this piece. But what I found really interesting was something I didn't know about him, which was his own biography. His father died when he was an infant, and he never knew his dad. And he grew up in, like, abject poverty. His mother never remarried, and he grew up in a very sort of hardcore fire and brimstone fundamentalism. And it wasn't until he was in college and he came to sort of be introduced to a sort of more mainstream evangelicalism that helped him question a lot of the like hardline fundamentalism he had been brought up with, and that really sort of brought him into a sort of different theological position from which these notions of mercy, grace, and forgiveness, like, made a lot more sense to him, and were sort of the truer form of Christian theology and his belief. And so knowing that sort of biographical background was so fascinating to me in sort of illuminating his particular contributions in the 90s. And so it's a really smart piece. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 3 years ago. And so that's also, I think, sort of relevant to his announcement that he's no longer going to have a public career. But anyway, it's an interesting piece in the New York Times. We'll link to it. But I always love when biology illuminates theological history and theological belief systems, because for me, those things are very interconnected in the ways I think about this as a historian. So I found that fascinating in this particular example.
Yeah, no, it was a great article. And one of the things that perhaps I didn't read carefully enough, Yancey was also married.
Yes.
He was adulterous in his own marriage as well. His wife put out a statement saying that she's forgiven him and God is love and this will not be an issue for them moving forward. I kind of wondered what the mission was in announcing it. And the reporter didn't quite get to that. But I wonder if Yancey wanted us all to take our own lessons from it.
Well, I think so he's been married to his wife of 55 years. They both released statements that were published in Christianity Today, the sort of, leading influential evangelical magazine, or at least it used to be.
Which everyone should read, by the way.
A remarkable and really incredibly intellectual and learned, American magazine, started by Billy Graham in the mid-1950s. It has its own fascinating history in itself. But I think, that's a really good point. Especially because mostly when evangelicals come forward and admit this stuff, it's for career rehabilitation, right? Like I've been caught and like I have to do this in order to like maintain my, mega church pulpit or whatever, my huge like online ministry. This is sort of an interesting example because he's like, this happened, I did this, and because of this, I'm stepping back from any sort of public profile. I didn't read the Christianity Today statement, which I think probably would illuminate more of why he's doing it and what he hopes to to make of it. But I think that there's a way that like this might be what he believes is necessary for true repentance, as that he was a public figure, one who wrote much over his career about marriage as a religious institution. And so that like this is part of him feeling like he's doing the right and full expression of true repentance, which is not how we often see the motivations behind this action when it comes to people like, again, trying to preserve their high-profile ministry or whatever.
There should be a whole social media platform for sincere apology. I think we would all learn a lot from that.
We would do well to have that.
I'm being facetious, but I'm actually also being serious here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll make this quick because I don't want to try our listeners' patience by keeping them on too much longer. But what I want to go viral this week is a piece written by Vivek Ramaswamy, who I almost never pay attention to, called "Social Media is a Trap for Politicians." It was in the Wall Street Journal this week, in which Ramaswamy cautions us about the fast and inaccurate information that is reflected back to politicians from a platform populated by extremists. And I thought it was fascinating because in a way he's trying to distinguish himself from a certain element of MAGA, but he was also making a very interesting point about why politicians do what they do that I think is actually very relevant to what happened in Minneapolis and how the Trump administration is responding, which is that politicians put stuff out on social media to see how many likes they get. And it is a kind of instant polling of positions that when the news is moving so fast that you can't poll things and you don't actually know what your constituency wants, you put it out on social media and hope that they will tell you. You will see, are they responding positively, negatively? What about your story are they buying and what are they not buying, and so on. And Ramaswamy is saying this is a terrible way to govern, We should not be governing by asking people's opinion on social media, in part because it maintains the fiction that social media really is a democratic space, when real democracy actually happens at the ballot box and happens through constituent services and so on and so forth. But the other reason it's bad is that people are making snap decisions on policy based on inaccurate information. You know, the vast majority of Americans are not on X. And if X is how you are testing out your ideas, inevitably you are going to be driven to an extreme by the positive responses that you're getting there. So Vivek Ramaswamy, he's a very strange man, and he's a very strange looking man, and I don't really like him, but he's beginning to distinguish himself by picking out certain aspects of Trumpism that are unsustainable and wrong and bad for politics. He is running for governor of Ohio, and it's looking like right now that he's doing very well. It's a Republican state, so we're not even going to pretend that a Democrat could be governor of Ohio. But there's a great article, Social Media is a Trap for Politicians, on the Wall Street Journal opinion page. I'm going to be linking to it, and everyone should read it.
We should do a segment on him. I mean, he would be a fascinating conversation. And I will also say, and I think this is, potentially related to his ideas and his concerns here, he's being subjected to absolutely horrific racism online as he runs for governor of Ohio. And so I imagine, I don't know if he addressed that directly in the piece, but I imagine that's probably shaping a lot of his notions about what the internet means and what it constitutes and what it puts into motion in American political life.
Okay, so many things to talk about in 2026, Neil. I am so happy to be back online with you, and I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Ropa Vieja by Alessandro Gugal. You can find his work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.